Tanya Degurachev used to be one of Japan's elite office workers, but his staunch atheism and refusal to acknowledge a powerful deity as God in the moments before his death caused the deity to reincarnate him into the body of a young girl in an alternate war-torn Europe as punishment or as a practical joke. She enlists in the military and encounters numerous hardships, which only serve to strengthen her resolve to not place her faith in any god or deity. At the Rhine, the Imperial Army fights a battle of attrition against the Francois Republic. It's not much of a battle because they are getting destroyed. They rally themselves for another wave of attacks, but are successfully pushed back, with several soldiers gunned down. Moments later, a squad of mages commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Tanya Degurachev arrives on the scene, successfully providing reinforcement and covering fire through an explosion spell. Meanwhile, at Imperial Strategic Headquarters, Lieutenant Colonel Rerugin and 2 brigadier generals discuss the war efforts and how best to allocate their resources, as they have lost more than half of their deployed units, and don't have enough reserves to send reinforcements to the battlefield. Tanya commands her platoon on the battlefield, urging them to delay the enemies via flanking attacks. When 2 corporals get ahead of themselves, they disobey her orders to stay behind and instead advance deep into enemy territory and destroy their artillery. In the evening, at the camp of the Imperial Army, Tanya summons her platoon to her tent. She attempts to dismiss the 2 corporals who had earlier disobeyed her orders, but like blockheads who haven't learned their lesson, they refuse their dismissal. Tanya readies her sword to cut them down for insubordination but is stopped by another platoon member, Corporal Victoria. She settles for a lesser punishment and transfers the 2 disobedient mages to the rear, where it is safer, never to see the light of battle again. Later at night, Tanya leads an aerial expedition with Victoria and a few other platoon members, but Victoria falls to the ground due to fatigue and is taken back to the camp. At the camp, Tanya and the rest of her platoon are briefed by their company commander about the 403rd Mage Company and the trouble they encountered with enemy mages. Tanya offers to lead a solo rescue mission, stating that Victoria is at her limit. Victoria, annoyed at being referred to as useless, insists on coming despite Tanya's refusal, and they set off. Everyone in this platoon is really stubborn. Sometime later, while Tanya and the 205th are en route to reinforce the 403rd Assault Mage Company, who are under heavy fire, the 403rd is wiped out by Republican Army mages. If only their help had arrived sooner. Tanya orders the 3 other members of her platoon to rendezvous with other members of the 205th and engages the Republican mages herself. Tanya annihilates them as easily as a kid playing video games after they refuse her demands to surrender, and her platoon watches in amazement as she turns all remaining enemy mages to ash. Later, in the Republican capital, at the Ministry of Defense, military leaders discuss Tanya, who is given the moniker Devil of the Rhine by Republican Army troopers for her fearsome combat abilities and performance. Victoria learns that the insubordinate mages that Tanya had previously sent to the rear are dead after enemy forces bombed the bunker where they had been stationed, something Tanya had anticipated and planned for. She really is a devil. In Tokyo, 2013, an incompetent, underperforming salaryman was fired by his supervisor despite his pleas. Unknown to the supervisor, the salaryman tails him on his way home and pushes him in front of an oncoming train. As the supervisor falls to his untimely death, time stops, and he hears the words of a self-proclaimed god, in all directions coming from the people at the station, demanding the supervisor acknowledge him as God. The supervisor immediately rejects the possibility because, if God were real, he never would have let him be pushed into a train in the first place. He asserts his opinion that the being is not God and names it Being X. The dude is probably just an atheist. He tells the faceless voice that he doesn't need to have any faith in a creator because all his needs are already met and he is living comfortably. Being X, shocked by the supervisor's uncouth assertions, concludes that the supervisor lacks faith in him because he does not live in circumstances that would require him to have faith, and decides to reincarnate the unrepentant supervisor in an alternate 1913-era Europe, where he would potentially face enough troubles that he would have no choice but to have faith in Being X. The voice urges him to live as long as he can in this new world, as there will be no second reincarnation. Despite his protests, a light flashes, and the flow of time is restored. Now reincarnated as a baby girl, Tanya grows up in an orphanage on the outskirts of the imperial city of Barun. Due to the impending war in the country, the orphanage is run down, making it impossible for a helpless, powerless girl like her to survive. However, it is discovered that she has an exceedingly high magical aptitude, and she decides to enlist in the Imperial Army, where she believes that she would fare better than as an orphan. She performs well, and in less than a year, she is entrusted with training new cadets at a military academy, but she is ruthless and unforgiving to her students. A cadet once tried to resist her brutal training, but she immediately subdued him and readied her gun to blow his skull to bits until Lieutenant Rerugan stopped her. Despite a few minor issues, she finishes her training at the age of 9. Before graduation, she was deployed as an artillery observer in the north during the initial invasion of the Empire by the Entente. What was supposed to be her last training exercise quickly turns into a fight for survival, when Lieutenant Colonel Anson Su of the Entente then leads a company of the 5th Aerial Mage Battalion against her. Unprepared for the encounter, she requests permission to leave the battlefield, but she is ordered to stay and delay the enemies until reinforcements arrive. What kind of maniac forces a child to fight in a war? She tries her best to fight off her attackers, even going as far as detonating herself along with 3 enemy mages. Anything to get the win. Later, back at the garrison headquarters medical room, Tanya is awarded the Silver Wings Assault Badge and hopes she isn't sent to the front lines. She better call CPS. Instead, she is dressed up and celebrated as a hero of the Empire. A few days after recovering from the injuries she sustained in her first battle, Tanya is assigned to the Tactical Instructor Squad, away from the front lines, to her great relief. After receiving her deployment orders, she is told to go to the General Supply Staff for technology testing. She tests a new type of computation jewel, which is a device necessary for mages to perform magic, the Elenium Type 95. But this proves to be as dangerous as fighting on the front lines, due to the extreme instability of the Type 95. Ignoring the dangers, Chief Development Engineer Adelheid von Schugel pushes her to her limits, but is unable to make the Type 95 sufficiently stable. Maybe this mad scientist just wanted to get rid of her. The device explodes once again, and she dumps it and goes to the medical room. Didn't she just recover from some injuries? After criticizing the technology, she requests a transfer, which is approved, and the project is frozen. That night, Being X speaks to her through a doll on her bedroom window. It accuses Tanya of not having developed any faith or insight and offers to bless her. It looks like this god is lonely and really needs a friend. Tanya disagrees with Being X and destroys the toy. She wakes up the next day, assuming it was all a dream, but sees a paper with Deus lo vult, which means God wills it, written on her bedside. Tanya participates in one more experiment, and just as the Type 95 is about to explode, Being X performs a miracle and stabilizes the jewel to prove his power to Tanya. As a result, the Type 95 is now usable only for Tanya, and greatly amplifies her power when used, but only on the condition that she has to pray to Being X whenever she uses it. She definitely sees this as a curse, not a blessing. The next year, Tanya is again sent to the front lines, eventually leading to the events of Episode 1. Meanwhile, at the Imperial headquarters, Tanya is recommended for officer training due to her exploits in her first battle, but Lieutenant Rerugan tries to refuse due to her craziness and unusual personality. I think this guy is just jealous. The rest of the military leaders ignore his opinion and decide to send her, and she recommends Victoria for officer training as well. She is promoted to first lieutenant, and she and Victoria prepare to return to the capital's military academy for officer training. Meanwhile, headquarters realizes the necessity of a rapid response unit in the Imperial Army. 6 months after leaving the front lines, Tanya is enjoying her lazy life in the capital, is still training to be an officer at the military academy, and is doing well in her studies. In the academy's library, she meets General Zidur, whom she holds in very high regard, and he asks for her opinion on the ongoing war. Why do these people think that a 10-year-old would know a lot about war? She predicts that it will become a world war involving the most powerful countries, and outlines a strategy for the Empire, using defensive infantry tactics and mages' firepower and agility to minimize military losses. He is impressed by her battle knowledge and tactical ideas and asks her to put together a formal proposal, which she sees as an opportunity to further advance her career in the capital. Later, Tanya meets Captain Uger, one of her academy colleagues, in a cafe in the city. Uger, out of concern, tells Tanya to consider leaving the military because she is still a child. Finally, the first sensible adult in this anime. Tanya asks if he doubts her capabilities, but he reveals to Tanya that he is more concerned about his family and the future impact the war will have on his daughter, whom he fears may one day be forced to fight for the Empire. He tells her that sending kids to war is wrong. Tanya then emotionally manipulates him into dropping out of the academy in exchange for a safer line of work, thereby securing her position as one of the elite students at the academy. This evil brat never cared about the dude's situation. General Zetour passes Tanya's plan to General Kurt von Rudersdorf, and at a conference held at the Imperial Strategic Headquarters, Zetour tables the plans for a rapid response mage battalion, which is accepted. At least Rerugan wasn't around to hate on her plans. At the Western Theater garrison, Rerugan is furious when he learns that Tanya's plan has been implemented with her in command of the Rapid Reaction Force. Tanya is invited to dinner with the Colonel and General Zetour, where she is served food like she has never tasted before. For her post-graduation deployment, she is put in charge of a new Rapid Response Mage Battalion and will be promoted to the rank of captain upon graduation. All of a sudden, all her dreams of having an easy life in the capital are destroyed before her very eyes. To her horror, this will be more perilous than fighting on the front lines. She tries to talk her way out of the posting, but is shut down and told to pick 48 people for the battalion. The general issues her a final warning concerning her attitude toward her former cadets, and then she leaves the dinner. The next day, at the Imperial headquarters, Tanya attempts to use the lack of personnel as an excuse to further delay the implementation of the battalion, especially after she receives a large number of applications for the battalion. But a newly promoted Victoria is assigned to assist her, thus preventing her from delaying any further. Quite unlucky for a little girl. Try as they might, Tanya and Victoria are unable to go through all the applications by themselves, and Victoria speaks to Garrison Command for help. They send dozens of unoccupied MPs and personnel in order to get the work done as quickly as possible. Tanya despises Victoria for taking the job seriously. Tanya holds a test to decide whether or not the mages who have sent in the applications are worthy of joining the new battalion, but most fail, resulting in a low recruitment rate, leading to her superiors complaining that her standards are set too high. Tanya accepts this compromise to accept more lower standard mages, but declares that she will need at least a month to re-educate the mages and bring them to an acceptable standard, permitted to re-educate them however she likes, even if things have to get rough. She smiles like a villain after hearing that. She holds a grueling training regime, with many recruits nearly dying. This demonic child loves torturing fresh recruits. She hopes that this will deter them from further training. The mages are instead frightened that dropping out will incur even worse punishment and decide to continue. Some of them are even inspired to meet her high standards, and within a month, they have been successfully transformed into skilled soldiers. She then receives instructions from Lieutenant Rerugan to go with her battalion, named the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion, to the southeastern garrison as the Dukedom of Dacia has mobilized its troops and crossed Imperial borders. The first battle that the 203rd encounters is a walk in the park. The Dacian infantry is so useless in warfare. They have no mages and still use outdated techniques. Tanya and her battalion easily pick them apart from the skies as they scatter around like ants on the ground. She then takes a handful of mages from her battalion to the Dacian infantry camp to terrorize them further, and she takes their commander hostage. Tanya commands her battalion to follow her to the Dacian capital to further test their skills in combat. There, they locate the weapons factory, which is undefended from aerial attack. Tanya orders the 203rd to attack it, but says they can only destroy it if they have declared their intentions in advance, allowing for armed retaliation. This would, however, give away the 203rd's surprise advantage. So Tanya uses a childlike voice to broadcast her intentions to destroy the factory over a radio, another one of her evil schemes. It is dismissed by the factory workers as a harmless child's prank, allowing the 203rd to destroy the factory. The 203rd, satisfied with their success, returns to base. We're just going to ignore the fact that they committed a war crime. Several days after Tanya's battle with the Dacian forces, military leaders at the Imperial headquarters conclude in a meeting that Imperial troops should be able to completely occupy Dacia by winter, and then turn their attention to the fact that the Empire is still fighting on two fronts, against the Entente and the Republic. They decide to focus on destroying the weaker Entente first, but are worried that there will not be sufficient resources for them to do so, with there only being enough to last the Imperial army through winter. Issues with their supply lines prevent them from sending more resources, so they decide on using their ace in the hole, Tanya and her 203rd Battalion. At the Imperial Army garrison, Tanya informs her battalion of the orders from HQ to head to the north and confront the Entente. After the meeting, she and Victoria discuss the possibility of the Entente being allied to the Republic and/or the Allied Kingdom, which is later shown to be true. She also ponders whether being X may be orchestrating the upcoming World War. In the north, the Imperial Army's Viper Battalion fights against Entente forces to defend their supply base, but faces huge losses. The 203rd comes in just in time to rescue them, launch a counterattack, and take all the glory. When offered reinforcements, Tanya refuses because she wants her troops to fight as if their lives are on the line, because they really are, and create a reputation for themselves. She chooses to go after enemy bombers alone, leaving the rest of the 203rd to attack the enemy mages. After downing a flight of bombers like helpless chickens, she lands, hoping to find survivors she can interrogate and then torture. Being X once again stops time, animates a dead Entente soldier, and asks Tanya how it feels to fight a war against the whole world. Tanya immediately shoots down Being X's avatar and later eradicates a hidden observation post that was tracking and gathering data on her. It's never a good idea to be a stalker. The Republican Capital Ministry of Defense, Lieutenant Colonel Bianto informs General Lugo of the failure of the Entente's attacks and Republican mage casualties, advising him to refrain from sending more Republican mages to assist the Entente. However, Lugo refuses. Tanya returns to Northern Forces Command and is welcomed by General Rudersdorf and her #1 hater, Lieutenant Rerugan. They tell her she will be heading to the front lines to take out enemy defenses, and she vows to teach all enemies that come against her a lesson. In the Entente Ministry of Defense, it is revealed that Anson Su has been promoted to colonel, but is worried about dying and leaving his wife and daughter behind. At the Entente Alliance port, Colonel Su bids farewell to his family as he leaves for his post at Orsfjord, located far from the front lines. Sometime later, he discovers that his daughter left behind a rifle as an early Christmas present. Meanwhile, at the Imperial Army Northern Command Strategy Conference, Tanya proposes a strategic retreat, shortening supply lines for retreating Imperial forces, thus allowing the Imperial Army to resupply and making it easier for them to launch an offensive in spring. The Northern Army commander believes her idea for a retreat to be too cowardly and shouts at the young girl to have a spine. She asserts that while the retreat would continue the war, an offensive at the moment would exhaust the Imperial Army in the north, thereby limiting their effectiveness. Despite this, it is decided that an offensive will be carried out regardless of the potential losses, and Tanya excuses herself from the meeting. Afterward, during a private conversation with Rerugen and Rudersdorf, she deduces that the main purpose of the offensive is to be a diversion for Imperial forces to launch an attack from the sea at the rear of the enemy. Due to her intelligence in figuring out the plans without having heard them before, Rudersdorf decides to reward Tanya with more work by sending her and the 203rd to launch a surprise attack at the heavily defended Orsfjord, ahead of their North Sea landing force. Tanya rallies her battalion, and they launch an aerial attack. During the attack on the fjord, the 203rd is intercepted by a battalion-sized unit of mages led by Colonel Su. It seems he doesn't have any PTSD from their first encounter. Tanya leads the first company in intercepting the enemy mages and orders the second and third companies to destroy the defensive cannons located along the coast. This allows the fleet to land and take control of the railroads. The first company easily destroys Su's mages, and in a fit of anger, he foolishly charges Tanya out for revenge. She easily avoids his gunshots and flies at him at full speed, impaling him through his stomach. So much for his revenge. He falls into the sea, thinking of his family. Tanya recovers Su's rifle and claims it as an early Christmas present. While her soldiers celebrate, Tanya smiles at the destruction they have wrought and her victory. Later, Su's wife and daughter in Arkansas hear over the radio that Orsfjord's defenders were wiped out, causing his daughter to cry. In April of the next year, Tanya and her battalion are back on the Rhine front in a battle against the Entente Alliance. Despite being heavily outnumbered, they clean up the battlefield easily and head back to camp. Tanya receives a letter informing her of a rebel uprising in Arene City supported by Republican Army mages against Imperial occupiers, located in former Republican territory. This presents a real problem, because the rebels now control the large railroad that passes through Arene, which is straining Imperial supply lines. The 203rd is ordered to intercept and destroy all traces of resistance, even if it means civilian casualties. Civilians better start packing their things and moving out. They find the city heavily defended and struggle to break through the Republican Army's mages initially. However, after a fierce attack by the 203rd, the battered Republican mages cancel their assault and seek shelter in a building. Tanya allows them to retreat and broadcasts a message to the entire city, asking all civilians to be released and for the rebels to surrender peacefully, or they will be considered enemy soldiers and treated accordingly. Following the rebels' refusal to surrender or evacuate, the 203rd observes the murder of a captured Imperial soldier by the Arene rebels, providing a valid justification for retaliation. Just what Tanya the Devil had been hoping for. Arene comes under heavy attack from Imperial artillery, causing numerous civilian deaths. Republican mages are driven off completely, and control of Arene is returned to the Empire. Second Lieutenant Grants refuses to open fire on the Arene rebels as they attempt to flee the city, but Tanya pressures him into doing so. There truly is no depth to the wickedness of this child. He succumbs and fires at the defenseless civilians. At the strategic headquarters, Zeter discloses to Reincarnates that the idea for the destruction of Arene City stemmed from a paper written by Tanya, which outlined strategies for legalizing urban combat and bypassing international restrictions on city bombardment. She is something of an evil genius. A few days after the Battle of Arene, Tanya meets Major Uger from the military academy while on her way back to Strategic HQ. He tells her of a plan to withdraw Imperial forces on the Rhine in an attempt to draw Republican forces into a trap and destroy them, with Tanya and the 203rd acting as the rear guard. In a conference at Imperial Army Strategic HQ, Zeter proposes a plan to military leaders to avoid defeat rather than attempting to win. The first step of the plan will involve a large-scale withdrawal of battle lines to lure the enemy forward, leading to the rest of the plan phases. Pretty sure this guy is just a scaredy cat. Meanwhile, Tanya and the 203rd are engaged in battle at the Rhine front and suffer numerous casualties. She is told to retreat due to the heavy losses, but she refuses so as not to reveal the plan too early. The first phase goes according to plan, and the Imperial forces retreat from the battle lines. In the medic camp, wounded soldiers are treated, and Victoria helps Lieutenant Grants, who is still conflicted by his actions in Arene City. Back at Imperial HQ, Reincarnates tells Tanya that the plan for the second phase is to take out Republican Command headquarters and their communication systems. She asserts that it will not be easy and that an unexpected tactic will be necessary to pull it off. Suddenly, the mad scientist, Engineer Adelheid von Schugel, bursts through the door like a crazy person, bringing good news. Schugel announces that a new high-speed rocket weapon, the V1, will transport the 203rd to the 3 potential locations of the enemy headquarters. The rocket flies too high to be intercepted and too fast to be pursued, so they can easily cross enemy lines and attack their headquarters. Although they haven't been tested, Schugel is confident and calls it a blessed message from God. Yeah, God is definitely just messing around with Tanya now. Meanwhile, at the Rhine, Republican forces fall for the Imperial troops' false retreat from the front lines and confidently advance their left flank. Their military leaders begin to celebrate, thinking they have the advantage. Unbeknownst to them, the Imperial army left booby traps while retreating. Tanya informs her battalion of the plans to utilize the V1, and they prepare for the upcoming battle. Colonel Su, now fully recovered, is seen to be traveling on an Allied Kingdom ship and plotting his revenge on Tanya. This dude hasn't even contacted his family. Tanya and the rest of her squad establish contact and prepare to march into the enemy bases. They will launch an infiltration and sabotage operation and run away like wimps after. At the Imperial High Council, various military leaders undergo a grilling by government officials on their strategy of withdrawal, accusing them of exposing Imperial manufacturing facilities to potential Republican attack. The government officials repeatedly scream at them to take responsibility and give a proper explanation. However, they delay their response, stalling for time while they wait for Tanya's unit to report on their status. Finally, Tanya's unit delivers their report, and Zeter announces to the Imperial High Council that the enemy headquarters and enemy command structure have been destroyed. He tells them that Phase 2 of their multiple-phase plan has been completed and informs them of the commencement of the third phase of the plan. Back on the battlefield, soldiers on the Republican Army's right flank complained about not having any action because only the left flank was permitted to advance into Imperial Army territory. One soldier decides to light a cigar, and in a cruel twist of fate, the traps left behind by the Imperial Army detonate simultaneously, blowing them to smithereens, resulting in widespread Republican losses. At least they got the action they were looking for. At Imperial HQ, Reincarnates announces that the third phase of the plan has been completed successfully, and they immediately propose to move on to the next phase without delay. Without communications, the Republican forces are in disarray and suffer a sustained counterattack by Imperial heavy armor and mechanized infantry who surround them. Upon investigating the cause of the communications breakdown, Captain Bientot of the Republican Army arrives at the ruins of the Republican Army's headquarters and is struck with horror. The next day, Tanya briefs her battalion on the situation on the battlefield and explains the 4-phase plan to them. They are all in high spirits considering the war is almost over, and they briefly celebrate their pending victory. They head to the battlefield to participate in the 4th phase of the plan, which involves conducting mop-up operations against remnants of the Republican Army. However, they are unexpectedly attacked by a mage unit from the Allied Kingdom. This unit is equipped with long-range and sniper weapons and is led by Colonel Sue. God will definitely be enjoying Tanya's prayers for this one. A company member is immediately shot down, and the diminished 203rd goes on the offensive rather than retreat. With no reinforcements in sight, they try their best to put up a fight, but are easily overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemy battalions opposing them. They use their high-altitude advantage and manage to take out a few enemy mages, but they suffer heavy losses, especially when Sue uses a magically enhanced trench gun. Sue pursues Tanya relentlessly, and when they come face to face, she stabs him in the chest with a hidden combat knife. Who brings a knife to a gunfight? She then recognizes him from their previous encounter, but he is possessed by being X and grabs her. Victoria arrives just in time to help Tanya break free from his grip, and Tanya empties an entire magazine into Sue, penetrating his magical defenses and turning him into a pincushion. Riddled with bullets, he makes a desperate move and detonates an explosive, hoping to turn the tide of the battle. No more coming back for him this time. Tanya and Victoria stand firm, shielding themselves against the powerful blast, as a battalion of Imperial reinforcements swoops in to drive off the Allied Kingdom mages. It is shown that, although injured, most of the 203rd managed to survive. With the battle over, their victory is announced, and they return home. 15 days after the severe losses suffered by Republican forces because of the four-phase plan, the Republican Army withdrew from the Republican capital, Paris, resulting in Imperial forces moving in and occupying the city, thus ensuring a glorious victory for the Empire. The Imperial High Council congratulates the military on their success and discusses the acquisition of the Republic's colonies. While the men of the 203rd were celebrating with a barbecue on a Republican beach, Tanya and Victoria discussed the end of the war. Tanya suspected that the Republic was planning to evacuate by sea to prepare for a counter-offensive. She requests permission from Imperial Army Command to attack the Republican military port, but is refused. She attempts to carry out her own reconnaissance, but is also denied. Frustrated and on the verge of tears, she wails like an infant about the missed opportunity to end the war. While the Empire celebrates the truce, Tanya looks for anyone on the military council whom she can talk to. She finds Rerugan, and they discuss it over coffee. Tanya asks Rerugan why the Empire isn't making adequate use of their victory. She tells him that while the soldiers who did the dirty work should be allowed to celebrate the victory, it is a mistake for the Imperial High Council to join in the revelry. Using her personal experiences as an example, she explains to Rerugan that human nature is inherently selfish and foolish, and that no matter how rational humans may claim to be, they will always prize feelings over reason, regardless of what they stand to lose. She concludes by explaining further that while the Empire has won a major victory, it is only a matter of time before the war restarts, because refusing to admit defeat and choosing to keep fighting, no matter the consequences, is simply part of human nature. Over on the southern continent, General Lugo of the Republican Army proclaims the birth of the Free Republic, vowing to continue fighting against the Empire till his last days. Meanwhile, news of the newly proclaimed Free Republic reaches the imperial capital, and it becomes clear to the Empire's citizens and soldiers that the war is far from over. The Empire's overwhelming growth finally pushes the remaining superpowers of the world to ally against the Empire. Survivors from the Entente Alliance and allied kingdoms joined forces with the Free Republic to strike against the Empire. Meanwhile, Mary Sue, who has now been blessed with being X's power just like her father, decides to enlist in the U.S. Army. She is told to reconsider as she meets the minimum age for volunteering, but she refuses. She makes her declaration and volunteers, swearing by God's name that she will give her whole power to avenge her father's death and create a world where no one else has to experience sadness. Her eyes flash, and tears stream down her face. While the battles begin once again, Tanya and her squad are sent to Africa to begin the fight against the Free Republic, which is basically the whole world at this point. As she rallies her troops, Tanya boldly declares that the war is evidence of God's failure, asserting that the power to influence mankind now lies in the hands of humanity, particularly in the hands of her soldiers. Once again, she fearlessly challenges being X. That's all, folks. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing content.